April 1945, a muddy prisoner compound somewhere near the Rhine. The sky hung gray and heavy, threatening rain that never came. Rows of German women stood in the cold morning air, their coats buttoned tight against more than the weather. Their hands were numb, their hearts hammered against their ribs. They had survived the bombs, the burning cities, the chaos of retreat. But now an American officer walked slowly down the line, his boots making soft sounds in the wet earth. He stopped. He looked at them with tired, unreadable eyes. Then he gave an order that made their blood turn to ice. "Open your coat." 3 words in English. 3 words that carried the weight of every warning, every poster, every whispered nightmare they had been fed for years. This was the moment they had been taught to fear most. The moment when the enemy would reveal his true nature. But what happened next was not what any of them expected, not even close. And when they finally understood what was really happening, some of them began to cry not from pain, not from shame, but from something they never thought they would feel again: relief. Before we continue with this powerful story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these untold chapters of history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. And if this story moves you, share it with someone who appreciates real history that doesn't sugarcoat the complexity of war. Now, let's continue. The moment hung suspended in the cold air like breath made visible. Some women froze completely, their fingers refusing to obey. Others grabbed their coat edges tighter, as if fabric could protect them from what they believed was coming. One young woman, a signals operator named Hannelore Voigt, felt her legs weaken beneath her. The mud seemed to rise up, ready to swallow her whole. Around her, she heard the sharp intake of breath, the muffled sob someone tried to suppress. This was it. The moment every radio broadcast had promised. The moment every propaganda poster had depicted in brutal caricature. The moment when surrender would reveal its true cost. And in that terrible instant of anticipation, Hannelore realized something that would haunt her for decades. She had been more afraid of her captors than she had ever been of the bombs that destroyed her city. The enemy in her mind was far more terrifying than anything she had actually seen. But that realization came too late. The officer was waiting. The order had been given. There was no choice but to obey. They were never supposed to be there. Not in uniform, not near the front lines, not standing in a prisoner cage with mud seeping through worn boots. But by 1945, the neat categories of total war had collapsed entirely. More than 500,000 German women served in auxiliary roles across the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS radio operators, typists, nurses, drivers, clerks. They were told they would remain behind secure lines. They were told they would be protected. They were told many things that turned out to be lies. Hannelore had been 22 when she was assigned to a signals unit in Bavaria. She learned Morse code in a clean classroom with wooden desks and a chalkboard. She wore a gray auxiliary uniform that felt almost official, almost like belonging to something larger than herself. She typed coded messages and plotted coordinates on maps. She never fired a weapon. She never saw combat. She thought that meant she was safe. Renata Kessler had worked as a clerk in a supply depot near the Rhine, tracking inventory in a basement office lit by a single dim bulb. The work was mind-numbing but steady. Until February 1945, When the American advance shattered the front lines and the depot was abandoned in a matter of hours, Renata grabbed her coat and climbed into the back of a truck with 11 other women. No one told them where they were going. There was only movement, only the desperate attempt to stay ahead of the collapse. Anneliese Falk was 19, a nurse's aide who had volunteered because it seemed noble, patriotic, necessary. She had imagined tending to wounded heroes in clean hospitals. Instead, she found herself in field stations that moved every 3 days, where men screamed on tables made from doors and there was never enough morphine. When the shelling grew close, they packed the trucks and ran again and again, until there was nowhere left to run. Waltraud Lindemann drove one of those trucks. She was 28, older than most, with strong hands and a face that revealed nothing. She kept her eyes on the road and her thoughts to herself. She had learned not to look at the faces of the wounded men in the back, not to listen to their prayers or their sobbing. She just drove through smoke, through mud, through roads clogged with refugees and deserters, until the day the road ended at an American checkpoint. Surrender came in pieces, unit by unit, checkpoint by checkpoint. Some women were captured at roadblocks. Others walked into captivity voluntarily, too exhausted to care anymore. Hannelore's unit was stopped on a country road outside Kassel. Young American soldiers pointed rifles and shouted orders in a language most of the women barely understood. Hannelore raised her hands. So did the 12 other women in the truck. One of the American soldiers looked confused. He called for his sergeant. "What do we do with them?" The sergeant shrugged. "Same as the men. Process them. Move them to the cage." The cage, that was the word that stuck. Prisoner cage. As if they were animals, not people. As if the uniform they wore erased everything else they had been. None of these women had been trained for captivity. There were no protocols, no instructions, no reassurances. They had been taught to type, to bandage wounds, to drive trucks through artillery fire, but no one had taught them what to do when the war ended and they became the enemy. Renata would later write in her memoir, "We did not think of ourselves as soldiers. We thought of ourselves as workers, as helpers. We believed that because we had not fought, we would not be punished. We were mistaken." By May 1945, Allied forces were processing tens of thousands of German prisoners every day. The camps swelled beyond capacity. Tents were erected in muddy fields. Barbed wire surrounded empty pastures. The women were separated from the men and moved into smaller compounds. There were no beds, no stoves, no privacy, just canvas, dirt, and cold that seeped into bones and stayed there. And in that cold, in that uncertainty, fear began to grow, not from what was happening, but from what they had been taught to expect. The propaganda had started years earlier. From 1943 onward, as the tide turned against Germany, Nazi officials began preparing the population for the possibility of occupation. But they did not prepare them with truth. They prepared them with terror. Joseph Goebbels understood one thing perfectly. Fear of the enemy kept people loyal, and so he fed that fear deliberately, constantly, ruthlessly. Posters appeared in train stations and town squares showing brutal caricatures of Allied soldiers. Beneath them, warnings were printed in bold letters. "Protect your women. Protect your honor. The enemy shows no mercy." Radio broadcasts told stories of occupied villages in the East, stories of violence and degradation designed not to inform but to horrify. Hannelore remembered listening to one such broadcast in early 1944. The voice was calm, clinical, but the words made her skin crawl. In the Soviet zones, German women are treated as spoils of war. There is no law, no protection, no mercy. She had glanced around the room. Every woman there had gone pale. The message was clear. Surrender means suffering. It was not just propaganda. It was poison. And by the time Germany collapsed, an entire generation of women had internalized a single belief. Capture by enemy forces meant humiliation, assault, or worse. Inside the prisoner compounds, information moved in fragments. A sentence overheard. A story passed from one woman to another in the darkness. No one knew what was true, but everyone listened. Anneliese heard a rumor her second night in the camp. An older woman claimed to have been captured weeks earlier. She spoke in a low voice near the tent flap. "They take you out at night," she whispered. "One at a time. You don't come back the same." Anneliese felt her chest tighten. She wanted to ask what that meant, but she was too afraid of the answer. Alfreda Roth heard a different version. In her section of the camp, the rumor was that the Americans were separating women for special interrogations. No one knew what that meant either, but the word special carried weight. It sounded deliberate, targeted, personal. Waltraud tried not to listen. She sat in the corner of the tent with her knees pulled to her chest, her coat wrapped tight. She thought about home, about the husband she might never see again. She tried to block out the voices. But at night, in the cold, with nothing but canvas between her and the unknown, even she could not ignore the fear. The numbers revealed the scale of what was happening. By May 1945, more than 80,000 German women were held in Allied prisoner camps across Western Europe. Most were concentrated in makeshift facilities in France, Belgium, and occupied Germany. The camps were overcrowded. Resources were scarce. Medical supplies were limited. But the greatest shortage was not food or blankets. It was information. The women were not told how long they would be held. They were not told what would happen next. They were not told anything. And into that vacuum, fear poured like floodwater. Then one morning, the waiting ended. Guards moved through the camp before dawn, shouting orders in English. Women were told to line up outside immediately. No delays, no explanations. Anneliese's hands shook as she buttoned her coat. Renata's breath came fast and shallow. Waltraud closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she had not said since childhood. Hannelore clenched her fists inside her pockets and thought about everything she had survived to reach this moment. And she wondered if this was where it would all end. The yard was not large, maybe 50 meters across. Bare dirt and patches of mud where rain had pooled. It was barely dawn. The sky was gray. The air smelled of wet canvas and wood smoke from the guard station. The women stood in uneven rows, shoulder to shoulder. Some had buttoned their coats wrong in the rush. Others had no coats at all. There were no chairs, no shelter. Just open ground and cold. Hannelore counted the women in her line. 23. She counted them twice to keep her mind busy, to stop herself from thinking about why they were there. Behind her, someone coughed a wet, rattling sound that came from sleeping on frozen ground too many nights. The American officers arrived quietly. No fanfare. No announcement. Captain Thomas Mercer stepped into the yard with a medic beside him. He wore a clean uniform. His boots were polished. His face was tired but neutral. He carried a clipboard. Behind him, Sergeant Dawson stood with his rifle slung over his shoulder. He did not point it at anyone. He did not need to. Nurse Lieutenant Mary Callahan followed a few steps behind, carrying a canvas medical bag. Her expression was calm, professional. To the women in the yard, they looked like judges. Captain Mercer walked slowly along the first row. His boots made soft sounds in the dirt. He did not speak. He simply looked at each woman as he passed, paused occasionally, wrote something on his clipboard, and moved on. The silence was unbearable. Somewhere behind Hannelore, a woman started to cry soft, muffled. She was trying to stay quiet, but the sound carried anyway. Then the order came. Mercer stopped in front of Waltraud Lindemann. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, not harsh, but it cut through the cold air like a blade. "Open your coat." 3 words in English. Waltraud understood English. She had learned it in school years ago, but for a moment her brain refused to process the meaning. She stared at him. He repeated it, slower this time. "Open your coat." Her hands moved to the buttons, but they would not obey. Her fingers were stiff not from the cold, from fear. Behind her, the other women had heard the command. Even those who did not speak English understood the gesture Mercer made, a simple motion with his hand, mimicking the opening of a coat. Annalise felt her knees weaken. She grabbed the arm of the woman next to her to stay upright. Alfreda closed her eyes. She thought she might be sick. This was the moment they had been warned about, the moment the propaganda had described, the moment when control would be taken, when dignity would be stripped, when war stopped being about nations and became about bodies. Renata felt something break inside her chest, not pain. Something worse, resignation. This is it, she thought. This is what happens now. Waltraud finally opened her coat. Her hands shook as she unbuttoned it and pulled the fabric apart. Beneath it she wore a thin gray shirt that hung loose on her frame. She had lost weight. They all had. She stood there, exposed, waiting. Corporal James Hartley, the medic, stepped forward. He looked at her, not at her face, but at her torso, her collarbone, her arms. He made a note, nodded to the nurse. Then he moved to the next woman. "Open your coat." The command repeated, row by row, woman by woman. Some obeyed immediately. Others hesitated. One woman tried to close her coat again after opening it. Sergeant Dawson stepped forward in it, threatening, but firm. The order was given again. She complied. When Hannelore's turn came, she did not wait for the command. She opened her coat immediately, stared straight ahead at the gray sky, and made herself disappear inside her own mind. Hartley glanced at her, wrote something, moved on. Hannelore closed her coat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fasten the buttons. What the women saw was humiliation. What the medics saw was something entirely different. Corporal James Hartley had been an army medic for 2 years. He had treated gunshot wounds in foxholes. He had amputated limbs in field hospitals. He had seen men die from infections that started as small cuts. He was 24 years old, and he was tired. When Captain Mercer briefed him the night before, the instructions were clear. "We've got a health crisis in the women's section. Respiratory infections. Possible tuberculosis, malnutrition. We need a baseline screening. Fast." Hartley had nodded. He had expected this. Every prisoner camp he had worked in faced the same problems. Too many people. Not enough food, not enough warmth. Disease spread quickly in conditions like that. Check for visible signs, Mercer continued. Weight loss, skin infections, frostbite, anything that needs immediate treatment. We can't afford an outbreak. It was not about control. It was about containment. The medical reality was grim. By spring 1945, prisoner camps across occupied Germany were overwhelmed. The Allied advance had been faster than expected. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and auxiliaries had surrendered in a matter of weeks. The infrastructure could not handle the numbers. In the women's section of the camp near the Rhine, more than 1,200 women were housed in space designed for 400. They slept on the ground. They shared blankets. They had no access to showers or proper latrines. Within 2 weeks, 12 women had developed pneumonia. 6 had died. The camp physician, a French army doctor named Laurent Beaumont, reported the deaths plainly. Without immediate care, more women would die. They were starving, freezing, sick. The inspection ordered was not punishment. It was triage. When coats opened, Captain Hartley looked only as a medic. Sharp collarbones meant malnutrition. Blackened fingertips meant frostbite. Waxy skin meant illness. Again and again, what he saw horrified him. Waltraud had lost nearly 15 kilograms. Her clothes hung loose, her eyes sunken. Hartley noted severe malnutrition and signaled Nurse Callahan, who placed a wool blanket in Waltraud's trembling hands. Alfreda Roth was worse. When she unwrapped her fingers, they were mottled purple and black. Advanced frostbite. She was taken gently to the medical tent. 17 women were held back for treatment. Inside the tent were cots, blankets, a stove. Callahan moved quietly between them. Anneliese Falk, coughing blood, was diagnosed with pneumonia. For the first time in weeks, she slept without fear. Whispers spread through the barracks. They had not been punished. They had been examined, treated, given blankets. Alfreda returned the next morning with bandaged hands, hot soup in her stomach, color in her face. 2 fingers might be saved. She had been given medicine and real bread. That word changed everything. Slowly, certainty cracked. They had been taught to expect monsters. Instead, they saw rules being followed. Prisoners treated as patients. Years later, Hannelore wrote that she feared not what she saw, but what she had been taught to see. Renata later said the distinction mattered. They were prisoners, not victims, and that saved them. The camps were cold and harsh, not kind. In that yard, 3 words caused terror. Open your coat. What followed was not violence, but care. A medic's glance, a nurse's blanket. Proof that fear can distort reality, and that even enemies sometimes act like human beings there.